The man was staring again. Britt registered it as data point number 47 in her ongoing observational study titled, Extremely Formal Man Who Apparently Has No Job and a Potentially Alarming Fixation on My Workplace. He stood at the pickup counter of The Daily Grind, a coffee shop whose name Britt found offensively chipper for 6:15 a.m. The man, however, was anything but chipper. He was a pillar of stillness in the morning chaos of clattering portafilters and shouted orders for oat milk lattes. Dressed in a black wool coat that probably cost more than her car, with white hair falling just past his shoulders, not old man white, but the kind of striking, luminous white that made him look like either an anime character or a very stylish ghost. He looked less like he was waiting for a macchiato and more like he was waiting for a subordinate to deliver news of a successful military campaign. His eyes were the main event. Dark, intense, and fixed on her with the unwavering focus of a predator that had just spotted a particularly interesting, if slightly clumsy, gazelle. He'd been doing this for 3 days. Britt, whose brain processed social cues less as intuitive feelings and more as a complex flowchart with too many variables, had run through the possibilities. 1. He is a secret shopper for corporate. Unlikely. Corporate wouldn't send someone who looked like he'd just stepped out of a Bronte novel. 2. He is a mobster. Possible. The coat was very mobstery. But he always ordered a single, very specific espresso and paid with a crisp 50, which seemed inefficient for organized crime. 3. He is attracted to me. Statistically improbable. Men who looked like that, like their cheekbones had been carved from marble by a disgruntled god, with hair like fresh snow that somehow looked intentional rather than medical, did not tend to go for women who occasionally got coffee grounds in their hair, and whose primary special interest was 19th century maritime disasters. 4. He has a significant social skills deficit. Bingo. It was the only explanation that fit all the data. The intense, unbroken eye contact. The profound silence. The way he stood ramrod straight, as if he'd been taught posture by a drill sergeant. The guy was just awkward. Terribly, beautifully, fascinatingly awkward. He was staring at her now, his gaze a physical weight. She could feel the other customers shuffling, unnerved by the sheer voltage of his attention. Her coworker, Maya, was pointedly wiping down the espresso machine with more vigor than necessary. Okay, Britt thought, sliding his drink onto the counter. Intervention time. Here's your doppio, she said, her voice deliberately gentle, the kind one used on a startled deer. The man did not blink. His eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle shift that somehow amplified their intensity. Britt felt a strange, fuzzy pressure in her head, like the moment before a sneeze that won't come. It was the same feeling she'd had the last 2 times he'd stared at her. It was weird, but she'd felt weirder after 3 shots of espresso on an empty stomach. She leaned forward conspiratorially. Okay, look, can I give you a little feedback? The man's regal composure finally fractured. A flicker of something utterly alien crossed his face. It wasn't confusion, it was bafflement, as if a teacup had just started reciting Shakespeare. Feedback? His voice was a low, resonant baritone, smooth as aged whiskey. It vibrated in the air. Yeah, Britt said, still whispered. The staring, it's a lot. He blinked, once. A slow, deliberate motion. The staring. It's very intense, she explained. Like laser beam level intense. It can make people feel a bit targeted, you know? He said nothing. The fuzzy pressure in her head vanished, replaced by the normal background hum of the refrigerator unit. A good rule of thumb, she continued, warming to her subject, is the 3 to 5 second rule. You make eye contact for 3 to 5 seconds, then you glance away for a bit. At the menu, out the window, at your very nice shoes. It gives the other person a little breathing room. It shows you're engaged, but not like plotting their demise. She gestured with a damp cloth in her hand. The man stared at her for a solid 10 seconds. Then he glanced down at his shoes. They were indeed very nice shoes. Then his gaze snapped back to her face. "Like that?" he asked. "Getting there." The snapback was a little abrupt, a little, "I have now fulfilled the social contract and will resume surveillance." But the principle is sound. Progress, not perfection. He picked up his espresso, his long, elegant fingers wrapped around the tiny paper cup. A curtain of white hair fell forward as he looked down at it. For a man of his bearing, the cup looked absurdly small, like a giant holding a thimble. "My name," he said, "is Lucien." "Britt," she replied, "and you're welcome." Lucien held her gaze for exactly 4 seconds, then deliberately looked at the pastry case to his left. He looked back. A ghost of a question was in his eyes. Britt gave him a thumbs up. "See, you're a natural." He turned and walked out of the shop, his posture impeccable, his white hair and multi-thousand-dollar coat sweeping behind him like a character exiting a cut scene. He didn't look back. Maya immediately scurried over. "Okay, what was that? I thought he was going to hypnotize you and steal your social security number." "Nah," Britt said, wiping the counter. "He's just got some stuff to work on. I think he's trying." She didn't see the black, windowless sedan that collected Lucien from the corner, nor did she hear the conversation within. "My liege?" a voice dry as parchment inquired from the opposite seat. "You were in there longer than usual. Was there an issue with the doppio?" Lucien stared out the window, the bustling morning scene of Seattle rendered monochrome through the tinted glass. His mind, a vast library of experiences stretching back further than any living thing should remember, had just had a new wing built without his permission, and the architect was a 5'4" barista with espresso on her apron. For as long as he had existed, his will had been law. Not just the law of his kingdom, but a fundamental law of nature. When he focused his intent, his compulsion, on a mortal, their mind became his. He could pluck a name, a secret, a devotion from their head as easily as a man might pick a flower. It had never failed, not once. Until today. And yesterday. And the day before. He had focused his entire being on the woman, Britt, with a simple command. "Tell me your name. Give me your number. You will find me compelling." Her mind had not yielded. It hadn't even registered the attack. It had felt like pushing against a wall of static, a pleasant, buzzing, utterly impenetrable fog. And then, through that fog, she had offered him notes. "She thinks I have a social skills deficit," Lucien said, the words tasting bizarre on his tongue. Alistair, his chamberlain, a vampire so old that even other old vampires found him unsettlingly composed, adjusted his spectacles. "I'm sorry, my liege, I must have misheard. For a moment I thought you said—" "She gave me advice," Lucien continued, his voice flat with disbelief, "on how to make eye contact in a less intimidating fashion." Alistair's famously unflappable composure slipped. His mouth opened and closed silently. He had seen Lucien level armies with a word, bring empires to their knees with a whisper. He had seen him face down creatures of nightmare and never show a hint of doubt. "Advice," Alistair finally managed. "On social skills." "The 3 to 5 second rule," Lucien stated, as if announcing a new treaty. A long, profound silence filled the car. "Well," Alistair said, carefully polishing his glasses with a silk handkerchief, "that is unprecedented." "Yes," Lucien agreed. His gaze was distant. He wasn't just baffled. He was intrigued. Deeply. Dangerously. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since he'd first tasted wine from the Bordeaux region, back when the grapes were still being grown by monks who didn't know what they had. He was going to have to go back tomorrow. For observation. The next day, Britt was explaining the nuances of her favorite true crime podcast. "So the theory is that the lighthouse keeper, Jedediah Coombs, didn't just disappear," she said, leaning on the counter during a rare morning lull. They think he faked his own death to escape his debts. But the hosts of Murders and Mochas have a different idea. Lucian, who had taken up his post by the pickup station, listened with rapt attention. He had successfully executed a 4-second glance at the ceiling before returning his gaze to her, and he was feeling quietly proud of himself. They believe he was smuggling illicit goods, he surmised, his tone that of a man solving a simple puzzle. And his partners eliminated him. Britt's eyes lit up. Okay, close. But their theory is way more specific. They think he wasn't smuggling goods, he was smuggling people, escaped convicts, and one of them turned on him. They found a button near the cliffs that didn't match any of his known clothes. Lucian was silent for a moment. He had known Jedediah Coombs, a dour man with a penchant for watered-down rum and complaining about seabirds. He had, in fact, been smuggling illicit goods, specifically French silks, and had fallen off the cliff into the churning sea during a drunken argument with his supplier over percentages. The button belonged to the supplier, a pirate named One-Eyed Jean. Lucian had been there. He'd been trying to recruit Jean. The man had terrible teeth. An interesting hypothesis, Lucian said, the lie smooth and practiced. It was far more amusing to let her have her podcast theory. The hosts seem thorough. They're amazing. They cross-reference shipping manifests and census records. It's all about the data. Indeed, Lucian murmured. He was beginning to understand her. She wasn't immune to him in a mystical sense. Her mind simply operated on a different frequency. It was too busy cataloging, analyzing, and cross-referencing the world to have room for a psychic invasion. He might as well have been trying to compel a supercomputer by shouting at it. You should listen to it, she said. The new episode just dropped. It's about the mysterious death of the Duke of Orleans in 1407. Lucian raised an eyebrow. Is it? He had been in the room when the Duke of Orleans was assassinated. It wasn't mysterious at all. His cousin paid 2 knights a bag of gold to do it in a back alley. It was terribly déclassé. Yeah, they think it was a political conspiracy involving the Knights Templar. The Templars were disbanded a century prior, Lucian corrected, unable to help himself. It was a historical inaccuracy of staggering proportions. Britt waved a dismissive hand. That's what they want you to think. Look, just listen to it. You look like a guy who appreciates a good conspiracy. You know, you always dress like you're about to attend a funeral for a Victorian poet. What do you do for a living anyway? Are you a historian? Lucian considered the question. I am in asset management, he said. It was technically true. His assets included vast swaths of real estate, accumulated wealth that would give any accountant a nervous breakdown, and a few thousand immortal subjects. Oh, boring, Britt said, but she smiled. Well, Victorian, your espresso is up. The name stuck. That night, in the vaulted, cavernous main hall of his ancestral home, a Gothic monstrosity clinging to a cliffside overlooking the Puget Sound, the betting pool began. It was started, as most gossip in the court was, by Gregor, a guardsman who had been stationed at the main gate for so long that even he had stopped counting the years, and who had the bored, all-seeing eyes to prove it. I've got 50 on him scaring her off within the week, sneered a gaunt vampire named Cassian, whose cravat was tied with agonizing precision. Nonsense, Gregor countered, polishing his halberd. I say he asks her out. She'll say no, of course, but he'll ask. I'll give you 2-to-1 odds. Alistair swept by, his robes whispering over the cold stone floor. Gambling on the king's romantic pursuits is treasonous, undignified, and frankly, I want in. Put me down for 100 on, she gives him a nickname that he secretly despises, but publicly tolerates. Too late, Gregor grinned. She already calls him Victorian. Alistair stopped dead in his tracks. A slow, deeply weary smile spread across his face. Magnificent, he breathed. Absolutely magnificent. The human was a force of nature. A delightful, baffling, terrifying force of nature. The odds shifted dramatically. The new favorite was she convinces him to wear jeans. The odds on that were 1,000 to 1, but the dream was too beautiful not to wager on. Lucien was oblivious to this. He was in his library, a room so vast it had its own weather systems. He was listening to Murders and Mochas on a smartphone Alistair had procured for him. He held the sleek glass object in his palm as if it were a live cobra. The two hosts, chipper young women named Kate and Becca, were breathlessly explaining their theory about the Duke of Orleans. "And get this," Kate said. "We found a manuscript that refers to a shadowy figure present at the negotiations, a man who did not seem to age. Could this be a link to the Templars' legendary immortality serum?" Lucien closed his eyes. They were talking about him. He'd been trying to broker peace to protect his wine imports. The sheer, unadulterated nonsense of it all was infuriating and hilarious. He had to talk to Brit about it. She would appreciate the data inconsistencies. This was the thought that solidified his next course of action. He had been given advice. Be more casual. Ask her to do something. Engage in a shared activity. He would ask her for coffee. Somewhere else. As a civilian. The thought was more terrifying than facing down a rival clan. He spent 2 hours planning his phrasing. He would be direct, but not intense. Casual, but not sloppy. He practiced in front of a centuries-old tapestry, as he had no reflection to consult. "Brit, I would be amenable to consuming a caffeinated beverage with you at a location of your choosing." No, too formal. "Would you be interested in a coffee-based social outing?" Too clinical. He finally settled on a phrase he'd overheard a young man say in the shop. It seemed to work. The next day, he waited for a lull. He approached the counter. He took a breath he did not need. "I was wondering," he began, his voice a model of forced nonchalance, "if you would like to hang out sometime." Brit stopped wiping the counter and looked up at him, her head tilted. She studied his face, his rigid posture, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. She saw the monumental effort it was costing him. Her internal flowchart immediately landed on, he is trying to implement the social feedback and is terrified. It was, in its own way, incredibly sweet. "Are you asking the out, Victorian?" she asked, a gentle tease in her voice. "I am attempting to initiate a low-stakes, non-committal social interaction," he clarified, his carefully rehearsed lines crumbling into dust. She laughed, a real bright laugh that made something in his long-dead chest feel warm. "Okay, yes, I'll hang out with you." She grabbed a napkin and a pen. "But there are rules. 1, not here. It's weird to date a customer. 2, we go somewhere public. Because, she gestured to him. You still give off a slight might-murder-me-in-the-woods vibe. No offense." He felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. "None taken." "And 3, she said, scribbling her number, it's a non-date, just 2 people getting coffee, to see if you can act like a normal human person in a neutral environment. Capiche?" "Capiche," he repeated, testing the foreign word. He took the napkin. Her handwriting was a messy, energetic scrawl. It was the most valuable thing he had held in longer than he could remember. He had succeeded. He had secured a non-date. He felt a surge of triumph so profound he almost smiled. This was followed by a wave of sheer, unadulterated panic. He now had to act like a normal human person. He was going to need Alistair to do some research. The non-date was a disaster, a beautiful, glorious, comedy of errors disaster. Brit had suggested a walk in Discovery Park at sunset. It's the best time. The light gets all gold and pretty. Lucien, who had not seen a sunset in longer than most civilizations had existed, for the very good reason that it would incinerate him on the spot, felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. He'd instructed Alistair to research casual human dates, and his chamberlain had returned with a sheaf of printed-out articles from dubious lifestyle blogs. The advice was conflicting and bizarre. He arrived at the park dressed in what Alistair had assured him was the pinnacle of modern casual wear. Dark, impeccably tailored trousers, a cashmere sweater the color of a stormy sea, and a leather jacket that probably cost more than Britt's entire apartment. He looked less casual and more like a movie star attempting to go incognito and failing miserably. Britt was waiting on a bench, wearing jeans with a hole in one knee and a brightly colored hoodie. She was sipping from a thermos. "Hey, Victorian," she greeted him with a smile. "You found it." The coordinates were precise, he said, as if he'd navigated by sextant rather than Google Maps. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the clouds in obscene shades of orange and pink. To Britt, it was beautiful. To Lucian, it was a ticking celestial death clock. He found himself subtly angling his body behind a large fir tree. "Nervous?" she asked, noticing his rigid posture. "The sun," he said, the words tight. "I have a sensitivity." "Oh, like a migraine thing?" she asked sympathetically. "My mom gets those. That sucks. Here." She handed him a pair of cheap plastic sunglasses from her bag. "Maybe these will help." Lucian took them. They had bright pink frames and said "Party Time" on one of the arms. He stared at them. This was, without question, the most undignified object he had ever touched. He put them on. The world became a nauseating shade of rose. "Better?" "Infinitesimally," he ground out. They started walking. The conversation flowed, mostly from Britt's side. She talked about her cat, a grumpy Persian named Admiral Nelson. She talked about her attempt to learn pottery, which had resulted in a series of objects she described as vaguely cup-shaped lumps. Lucian found himself listening with an intensity that surprised him. Mortals, he'd long ago concluded, were ephemeral and their concerns trivial. But Britt's concerns weren't trivial to her. They were the texture of her life, and he found the pattern of it fascinating. "Want some hot chocolate?" she asked, holding out her thermos. "No, thank you," he said quickly. "My constitution is delicate." The last time he had ingested non-blood sustenance, he had tried a piece of cake at a party in Versailles. The resulting biological rejection had been so violent, he'd been forced to fake his own death and flee Paris. He was not keen to repeat the experience. "You have a lot of weirdly vague medical issues for a guy who looks like he could punch through a wall," Britt observed. "I am a paradox," he agreed solemnly. As they reached a viewpoint overlooking the Sound, Britt pulled a small paper bag from her backpack. "Pastry?" she offered. It was a croissant, flaky and golden. The smell of melted butter and baked dough hit Lucian's hypersensitive nose like a physical blow. He remembered eating a croissant, once, in a Parisian bakery, a lifetime ago. Several lifetimes. It had been a moment of pure, simple joy, a joy he could never experience again. A wave of something cold and familiar, loneliness, washed over him. "No," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "I do not eat pastries." Britt just shrugged, nonplussed. "More for me, then." She took a large bite, and a shower of flaky crumbs fell onto her hoodie. She brushed them off, oblivious to the existential crisis she had just triggered. The sun touched the horizon. A ray of pure golden light lanced through a gap in the trees. Lucien moved with a speed that was not humanly possible, sidestepping a full 6 feet to his left and ending up behind a large public trash receptacle. Britt stared at him. "Whoa, quick reflexes." "There was a bee," he lied, his heart, which did not beat, somehow pounding in his chest. The non-date ended with an awkward moment at her car. "So," she said, "despite your weird food things and your apparent phobia of direct sunlight, I didn't hate this." "My objective was to avoid being hated," he confirmed, sounding like a robot reporting a successful mission. "You're getting a C+ in normal human person, but an A for effort." She gave him a quick, hesitant smile. "Text me, Victorian." She got in her car and drove away. Lucien stood there in the deepening twilight, wearing pink party-time sunglasses and smelling faintly of garbage. He had survived. More than that, he felt a strange, unfamiliar lightness. He was still replaying the evening in his mind when he arrived back at the castle. Alistair was waiting for him in the grand entryway, a single eyebrow arched in question. "She gave me these," Lucian said, removing the pink sunglasses and holding them up for inspection. Alistair stared at them. "I see. She believes I suffer from migraines. A most practical diagnosis. She also thinks I am afraid of bees." Alistair's lips twitched. He fought it, but a small, strangled noise escaped him. It might have been a laugh. "The betting pool will need to be updated. The odds on he is forced to wear novelty accessories were quite long." Lucian ignored him, walking past and ascending the grand staircase. He was already thinking about what to text her. Alistair had provided him with a list of approved emojis. He found them baffling. What possible situation could call for a smiling pile of feces? The situation escalated, as it was bound to do. Brit's immunity, once a private curiosity for Lucian, had become a whisper in the shadowed corners of the vampire world. A human immune to compulsion was a myth, a boogeyman. But myths had a way of being true, and in a society built on psychic control, an immune individual wasn't just an anomaly, they were a weapon. Or a vulnerability. Lady Isolde of the rival court of the Cascades thought so. Isolde was a creature of high drama and higher ambition. She saw Lucian's quiet obsession with the mortal barista not as a quaint romance, but as a chink in his armor. If this human was truly immune, she could be turned. An assassin who could walk right up to the king, unaffected by his greatest defense. The possibilities were delicious. But first, she needed proof. She dispatched one of her top operatives, a slick modern vampire named Julian. His instructions were simple. Corner the girl, test her resistance. Don't harm her, just confirm. Brit was walking home from her shift, the alley behind the daily grind a familiar shortcut. She had her earbuds in, listening to the latest Murders and Mochas episode, this one about the Dyatlov Pass incident, a personal favorite. She was so engrossed in a theory about infrasound-induced panic that she didn't notice the man leaning against the wall until she was almost on top of him. She pulled out an earbud. "Excuse me." The man, Julian, smiled. It was a predatory, self-satisfied smile. "Brit, isn't it?" Red flag number 1. A stranger knew her name. Her podcast-addled brain immediately flashed a mental checklist from an episode titled Don't Get Murdered 101. "Do I know you?" she asked, her hand tightening on the strap of her bag. Inside, nestled next to her wallet and a half-eaten granola bar, was a can of pepper spray. A Christmas gift from her dad. "Not yet," Julian said smoothly. He pushed off the wall and took a step toward her. He focused his will, a lesser version of Lucien's compulsion, but still potent. "You are not afraid. You find me charming. You will come with me." To Brit, it just felt creepy. An intense, oily wave of wrongness. The guy's vibe went from generic handsome dude to maximum level sleazeball in half a second. His eyes were weirdly intense, too. It seemed to be a theme with these overdressed, socially awkward men. "Okay, I'm gonna stop you right there," she said, taking a step back. "Personal space, buddy." Julian frowned. The compulsion should be taking hold. She should be smiling placidly, her will eroding. He pushed harder. "You trust me. You want to tell me all about your friend Lucienne." The oily feeling intensified. Brit felt her skin crawl. This wasn't awkwardness. This was threat. Her heart started hammering. All the podcast warnings, all the self-defense tips, all the "stay sexy, don't get murdered" mantras coalesced into a single, decisive action. Her hand darted into her bag. Julian saw the movement and smirked. A phone? A wallet? It didn't matter. It wasn't a phone. She whipped out the canister of pepper spray, thumbed off the safety, and fired a direct 2-second burst right into his handsome, arrogant face. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. For a human, pepper spray is agonizing. For a vampire, with senses 1,000 times more acute, it was apocalyptic. It was like being doused in molten lava, blinded by the sun, and having his sinuses scoured with holy fire all at once. Julian screamed. It was not a dignified sound. It was a high, thin, shrieking wail of pure, unadulterated agony. He clawed at his face, his superhuman composure utterly shattered. He stumbled backward, crashing into a stack of milk crates. "Stay away from me, you creep!" Britt yelled, adrenaline singing through her veins. She backed away, keeping the can aimed at him, just like the podcast host advised. Miles away, in his library, Lucian felt it. A sudden, sharp spike of terror. Britt's terror. It lanced through his mind, a psychic scream he was somehow tuned to receive. He was moving before he'd consciously processed the feeling. He didn't use the door. He went through the stained glass window of the library, which depicted a somber scene from the life of St. George. The ancient glass exploded outward in a shower of colorful shards. Alistair, who had been on his way to consult a dusty atlas, simply sighed and made a mental note to call the glazier. Again. Lucien moved as a blur of black cashmere and fury through the night. The city lights streaked past him, a river of color. He followed the thread of Britt's fear, a beacon in the dark. He arrived in the alley a mere 27 seconds after leaving his library. He skidded to a halt on the wet pavement, the sound of his shoes the only noise. The scene before him was a tableau. Britt, fierce and terrified, holding a can of pepper spray like a holy icon, and one of Isolde's lapdogs, writhing on the ground, whimpering and covered in his own tears of blood, his face a mess of raw chemical burns. For a split second, Britt saw him. Not Victorian, her awkward, overdressed friend. She saw a king. His face was a mask of cold, ancient rage. His eyes glowed with a faint crimson light. Power rolled off him in palpable waves, a pressure drop in the air that made the hair on her arms stand up. It was the most terrifying and magnificent thing she had ever seen. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. He blinked, and he was just Lucian again, white hair disheveled, expensive coat askew. He looked like a 20-something who'd sprinted here from somewhere, except for his eyes, which held the weight of something much older. "Britt," he said, his voice low and steady. "Are you all right?" The whimpering vampire on the ground saw Lucian, and his agony was instantly eclipsed by sheer terror. With a guttural sob, Julian scrambled to his feet and fled, vanishing into the darkness with supernatural speed. Britt was shaking, the adrenaline starting to recede, leaving her feeling weak and jittery. "Lucian? What are you doing here?" "I was nearby," he said, the lie thin but necessary. He stepped toward her, his eyes scanning her for any injury. "Did he hurt you?" "No," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't think he even touched me. I pepper sprayed him." She looked down at the can in her hand, then back at Lucian. "It worked really well." A strange sound escaped Lucian's throat. It was a dry, rasping chuckle, devoid of humor and full of something much darker. "Yes," he said, "I can see that." He looked at the spot where Julian had vanished, his expression hardening again. The message was clear. Isolde had crossed a line. "Go home, Britt," he said, his voice gentle but firm, with an undercurrent of absolute command. "Lock your doors. Do not open them for anyone." He reached into his jacket. He pulled out a small silver locket on a delicate chain. It was exquisitely crafted, an antique. "Take this," he said, pressing it into her hand. "It will keep you safe." Britt looked at the locket. It was beautiful. In her rattled state, the gesture seemed incredibly gallant and old-fashioned. "Lucian, you don't have to." "Please," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "For my peace of mind." She nodded, her fingers closing around the cool metal. "Okay, thank you." She turned and hurried out of the alley, wanting nothing more than to be in her apartment with Admiral Nelson. Lucian watched her go. The moment she was out of sight, his face went cold. The locket was, of course, a tracking device. And a microphone. A relic from a paranoid age of vampire politics, repurposed for a 21st century barista. He turned to Alistair, who had arrived moments after him, moving at a more sedate but still supernatural pace. "My liege," Alistair said, his voice grim. "Lady Isolde has made a grave miscalculation." "She has," Lucien agreed, his voice a low growl. "She mistook my interest for weakness. She sought to turn my curiosity into a weapon against me." He straightened his jacket. "She will learn the difference between a king's fascination and a king's fury." "What are your orders?" "Dismantle it," Lucien said simply. "All of it. Her shipping lines, her financial holdings in the mortal world, her network of informants. Turn her allies against her with promises of her territory. Expose her indiscretions to the council. I want her court of the Cascades to be a hollowed-out shell by sunrise. I want her to be isolated, powerless, and begging for an audience she will not be granted." Alistair bowed his head. "It will be done." "And Alistair," Lucien added, his voice dropping to a whisper of pure ice, "find Julian, and inform him that his services are no longer required, permanently." Alistair nodded once and vanished into the shadows. Lucian stood alone in the alley, the lingering scent of pepper spray and fear hanging in the air. He had built his entire immortal existence on control. Control of himself, control of his territory, control of those around him. For the first time, he was acting not out of cold strategy, but out of a white-hot, protective rage for a mortal who thought he was afraid of bees. It was the most alive he had felt in longer than he could remember. Lucian overshot the fire escape. In his defense, he was agitated. The night had been a whirlwind of precise, ruthless activity. Alistair and his agents had moved through the digital and physical worlds like ghosts, severing Isolde's financial arteries, turning her lieutenants, and leaking carefully selected secrets. By the time the first hint of dawn threatened the eastern sky, Lady Isolde's power base had been reduced to rubble. Julian had been dealt with. It was a masterclass in vampiric asymmetrical warfare. But the cold satisfaction of victory was warring with a frantic, unfamiliar anxiety. He needed to see Britt. He needed to confirm with his own eyes that she was safe, that the event in the alley hadn't left some deeper mark. So he'd raced across the city, his speed fueled by this strange new engine of worry. He'd aimed for the rusty metal platform outside her third-floor apartment window and misjudged his velocity. Instead of a silent, graceful landing, he shot past it, ending up clinging to the brickwork by his fingertips, his very expensive shoes scrabbling for purchase next to her neighbor's satellite dish. He took a moment, hanging there, to question the entirety of his unlife. Then, with a sigh of deep frustration, he dropped down to her fire escape, landing with a soft thud. He straightened his coat, smoothed his white hair back from his face, a useless gesture as he couldn't check the results, and knocked on her windowpane. The lights were on. He could hear the faint, tinny sound of her podcast. After a moment, the blinds rattled up. Britt peered out, her face wary. She saw him, and her expression shifted to exhausted confusion. She slid the window open. "Lucian, it's like 4 a.m. Are you okay?" Then her eyes narrowed, focusing on his chest. He was still wearing the cashmere sweater from their non-date, and on the stormy gray fabric was a distinct, dark red spatter. "Did you fall in a puddle? Wait, is that ketchup?" Lucian looked down. It wasn't ketchup. It was Julian's. The finality of the operative's employment had been a bit messier than planned. He looked back at her face, at her earnest, worried eyes trying to diagnose a condiment stain, and the entire dam of secrecy and carefully constructed lies just broke. He couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't be Victorian, the awkward suitor. The absurdity of it in the face of the night's violent realities was too much to bear. "It is not ketchup," he said, his voice flat. He looked into her eyes. He didn't use his compulsion. He knew it was useless, but he held her gaze with all the weight of his true self. Britt, we need to talk. May I come in? Something in his tone, a deep, resonant gravity she'd never heard before, made her step back from the window without a word. She went to the front door and unlocked it. He walked around and met her there, stepping over the threshold she had just opened for him. The invitation was implicit, but it still sent a thrum of power through him. He was in. Her apartment was small, cluttered, and aggressively normal. A half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, a stack of books threatening to avalanche. Admiral Nelson, the Persian cat, sat on a bookshelf, regarding Lucien with imperial disdain. The air smelled of coffee and cinnamon. It was the most alien environment he had ever been in. Okay, she said, crossing her arms. You're starting to scare me a little, Lucien. What is going on? He took a breath. My name is Lucien de Valerios. I am the sovereign ruler of the Court of Night, the vampire kingdom that holds dominion over this territory. The man who attacked you was an agent of a rival court. He was sent to test a rumor that has been circulating about you. A rumor that you are immune to our kind's ability to influence the minds of mortals. Britt stared at him. She didn't laugh. She didn't scream. Her face went blank, her eyes slightly unfocused. He could almost see the flowchart in her head, the data points being furiously recategorized. The staring, the formal clothes, the not eating, the sun phobia, the weird hours, the impossible speed in the alley, the flash of terrifying power in his eyes, and the face, the impossibly sculpted face that she'd filed under unfairly attractive, but which now reclassified itself as literally not human. It was a pattern. A ridiculous, impossible pattern. But it fit the data better than any other hypothesis. Her gaze sharpened. The stare thing, she said, her voice quiet. That fuzzy feeling I get in my head when you look at me for too long. That's you trying to influence my mind? It is called compulsion, he confirmed. For every other human I have ever encountered, it is irresistible. Their will becomes mine. For you, it does not work. You seem to experience it as a mild distraction, and then you offer me constructive criticism. A beat of silence. Admiral Nelson yawned. Then Britt's eyes widened with a new, dawning horror. Wait, she said, her voice hushed. Every other person just does what you say? When you do the stare thing? Yes. She put a hand to her mouth. He expected fear. He expected revulsion. What he got was something else entirely. Her expression softened into one of profound, startling empathy. Wow, she breathed, her eyes wide and sad. That sounds incredibly lonely. The observation hit Lucien with the force of a physical blow. A lifetime, several lifetimes, of power, of command, of unquestioned authority, and she saw it not as strength, but as a cage. She saw the isolation at the heart of his power. No one had ever seen that. No one had ever dared. He had no response. He had conquered empires and survived wars, but this small woman in a cat hair-covered sweatshirt had just disarmed him with a single sentence. So, she continued, processing, you're a vampire king, and you're hanging out with a barista who talks too much about podcasts. She gestured around her tiny apartment. Why? I was intrigued, he admitted. The word felt pathetically inadequate. Your immunity was a phenomenon I needed to understand. A science project, she said, a flicker of hurt in her eyes. It began that way, he said, and for the first time, he felt the terror of vulnerability. He had to be honest. It is not that way now. And the guy in the alley? A political matter, he said, his voice hardening. It has been resolved. He glanced at the stain on his sweater. Britt followed his gaze. Resolved with ketchup, she murmured, a touch of gallows humor in her voice. She took a deep breath. Okay. A vampire king. My life is officially weirder than a Murders in Mochas episode. She looked at him, really looked at him, and the fear was gone, replaced by a weary, pragmatic curiosity. So, what happens now? That was the question, wasn't it? The power dynamic had been obliterated. He wasn't her mysterious, awkward suitor anymore. He was a predatory creature of immense power who looked like he'd graduated college last spring. And yet, in her presence, he had none. She was the one with all the power now, because she was the only person in the world who could look at him and say no. Now, he said, his voice softer than he'd intended, I suppose you decide if you ever want to see me again. She studied him for a long moment. He felt more judged under her clear, analytical gaze than he ever had before the entire Vampire Council. Well, she said finally, a small, tired smile playing on her lips. You're the only person who ever actually listens when I talk about the Dyatlov Pass incident. She gestured to her couch. Sit down, Victorian. You look like you've had a long night. And for God's sake, tell me that's not really blood on your sweater. I have a very good stain remover, but I need to know what I'm dealing with. He sat. It was the first time in longer than he could measure that he had taken an order, and it felt like coming home. The relationship they built was a strange and wonderful thing. It was a relationship with no leverage. Britt chose him every day, and they both knew she could stop choosing him at any moment. He couldn't compel her. He couldn't command her. All he could do was be with her. It was terrifying, and it was exquisite. Her introduction to the castle was a study in contrasts. Lucian, trying to be impressive, had the entire court assembled in the grand hall. Hundreds of ancient, powerful vampires stood in silent, dramatic formation, their eyes fixed on the massive, iron-bound doors. Braziers cast flickering, Gothic shadows up the vaulted ceilings. It was a scene of immense power and medieval grandeur. He'd had to formally invite her, over the phone. It was the most ridiculous conversation of his life. So you can't come into your own house? It is a matter of thresholds and dominion, Britt. Just say the words. Fine, come in, you ridiculous man. That counts. When she finally arrived, she didn't use the grand doors. She came in through a side entrance Gregor the guard held open for her, walked right past the assembled court, and stopped in the middle of the hall, looking up. Wow, she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. This is a fire hazard. The sheer number of open flames and floor-length drapes. Your insurance premiums must be insane. A collective silent shock rippled through the court. Cassian, the vampire with the perfect cravat, looked as if he might faint. Alistair, standing beside Lucian's throne, coughed to hide a laugh. The betting pool, which had been reopened with a whole new category of wagers, just saw a massive payout for she critiques his interior decorating within the first 5 minutes. Britt treated the ancient, terrifying vampires of the Court of Night like slightly weird co-workers. She argued with the Duchess about the best way to brew cold brew. She taught Gregor how to play solitaire on his phone during his long, boring guard shifts. She saw Lucian's throne, a monstrosity of carved obsidian and dark magic, and asked if it was ergonomic. It looks terrible for your lumbar support, she'd said, frowning. Do you get back pain? You must. Lucien, who had indeed been suffering from a dull ache in his lower back since somewhere around the Renaissance, had no idea how to respond. Her influence was subtle but profound. She brought him a weighted blanket, explaining it was good for anxiety. He, who had never felt anxiety before meeting her, and now felt it constantly, found the pressure strangely calming. She made him watch historical documentaries, which he would critique with vicious, first-hand accuracy, a running commentary that Britt found hilarious. That's not how Napoleon held his fork, he'd sniff. The man had table manners like a goat. Their biggest fight was about technology. She insisted he learn to text like a normal person. Your texts sound like royal decrees, she complained, reading from her phone. I shall arrive at your dwelling at precisely 8:17 p.m. Acknowledge. Who says acknowledge in a text? It is clear and efficient, he argued. It's weird. Just use an emoji or a GIF. Look. She showed him a gif of a cat falling off a couch. "This is how you say, 'I'm on my way, but I might be a little clumsy about it.'" He stared at the moving image. "The feline appears to be in distress." "It's funny, just try it." He did. The next day, she received a text from him. It was a single emoji, the stoic, unsmiling face. She laughed for 10 minutes straight. Then she found the microphone. It was a Thursday. She'd been wearing the locket every day since the alley. It was beautiful, and it made her feel safe in a way she couldn't quite articulate. But Admiral Nelson had knocked it off her nightstand at 3 a.m., as cats do. And when she retrieved it from under the bed, the clasp had cracked open. Inside, where a photograph might go, there was a tiny flat disc that was very clearly not a photograph. It was matte black, smooth, and had a faint seam that suggested it was more than decorative. Britt, whose podcast-trained brain knew exactly what a miniature surveillance device looked like, sat on her bedroom floor for a full 30 seconds in complete silence. Then she Googled, "What does a tracking device look like?" Then she Googled, "What does a listening device look like?" Then she compared the images to the disc in her hand. Her internal monologue, usually a running stream of analysis and wry observation, went very quiet. She put the locket on the kitchen table. She sat across from it. She stared at it the way Lucienne had once stared at her, with sustained, unblinking intensity. "Okay," she said, to the locket, and by extension, to whatever was listening. "I'm going to need you to come over here, right now." Lucien arrived in 11 minutes. He knocked on her front door this time, like a person. She opened it. Her face was very calm, which was, he had learned over the course of their relationship, her most dangerous setting. "Sit," she said, pointing to the kitchen chair. He sat. She placed the locket on the table between them, open, the disc visible. "Is that a microphone?" she asked. Her voice was level. Lucien looked at the locket. He looked at Britt. For the first time in their entire acquaintance, his famous composure did not break with dignity. It broke with something that looked remarkably like a kid caught stealing cookies. "It is," he said. "And a tracker. Also yes. So when you gave me this in the alley, after I'd just been attacked, when I was scared and you said, 'for my peace of mind,' you were bugging me." "I was protecting, you were surveilling me," she corrected, and her voice did something he had never heard before. It went cold. Not angry. Britt's anger ran hot, full of gesticulation and incredulous comparisons to podcast episodes. This was different. This was disappointment. "You did the thing. The exact thing your whole power does. You tried to control the situation instead of trusting me." The words landed with more force than any weapon in his considerable arsenal had ever managed. Because she was right. He had done exactly that. The locket had been a reflex, a king's reflex. Protect the asset, monitor the variable, control the outcome. "You're right," he said. The words felt strange. He did not say them often. "I know I'm right. That's not the point." She leaned forward. "The point is, did you listen? To my conversations, my calls, my life?" "Alistair monitored the feed for threats. I did not listen to your private—" "Alistair!" She sat back. "Your butler listened to my phone calls." "Chamberlain," Lucien corrected automatically, and immediately wished he hadn't. She stared at him. "Victorian," she said quietly. "You are on extremely thin ice, and you just corrected my vocabulary." He closed his mouth. A long silence. Admiral Nelson jumped onto the table, sniffed the locket, and batted it onto the floor with absolute indifference. "Here is what's going to happen," Britt said. "You are going to take that thing home. You are going to dismantle it, and then you are going to figure out how to worry about me like a normal person by texting me and asking if I got home safe, like everybody else on the planet." "I am not like everybody else on the planet," he said, but there was no defiance in it, just a quiet fact. I know, she said, and her voice softened, just a fraction. But you're going to try, because that's what you do. You try. He picked up the locket from the floor. He held it in his palm, this small, stupid device that had almost cost him the only thing his power couldn't buy. I will text, he said. With emojis. He hesitated. I will text, he repeated, with less certainty. She almost smiled. Almost. Get out of my apartment, Victorian. I'll see you tomorrow. He left. He dismantled the locket that night, personally, in his library. Alistair watched from the doorway. My liege, he said carefully. The surveillance is finished, Lucian said. She told me to text. Alistair absorbed this. With emojis? Apparently. I see. Alistair adjusted his spectacles. I shall update the betting pool. The odds on she discovers the bug and doesn't immediately end the relationship were, I believe, paying 12 to 1. Who bet on that? I did, my liege. Lucian stared at him. You bet that she would find the surveillance device. I bet that she would find it and stay, Alistair corrected, with the faintest ghost of a smile. The woman pepper-sprayed an operative. I was not about to underestimate her. But beneath the comedy, something deeper was growing. He found himself watching her sleep, a state of unconsciousness he could never experience. He'd sit in a chair in her room for hours, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, marveling at the peace on her face. He was an eternal sentinel, guarding her fragile mortality, and the sight filled him with a fierce, aching tenderness that hurt more than sunlight. Lady Isolde, stripped of her power and influence, made one last desperate play. She couldn't attack Lucien physically, but she could attack the foundation of his new happiness. She arranged for the owner of the Daily Grind to receive an anonymous and very generous offer to buy his property. The new owner's plan? To demolish it and build luxury condos. Britt was devastated. The coffee shop wasn't just a job, it was her place, her routine, the predictable hub of her world. She came to the castle that night, her eyes red-rimmed. They're closing it, she said, her voice thick. Some faceless corporation bought it, just like that. It's gone. Lucien knew instantly it was Isolde. It was a petty, cruel move designed to show Britt that her small, human world was fragile, easily broken by the kind of power that Lucien and his kind wielded. It was meant to drive a wedge between them, to highlight the chasm that separated their lives. He felt the familiar, cold rage rise in him. He could undo it. He could buy the corporation, ruin the developer, compel the city council. He could fix it with a few words, a few displays of his immense power. But he looked at Britt's face, and he saw that wasn't what she needed. She didn't need a king to solve her problems. She needed a partner to share her grief. So instead of making calls, he just sat with her on the ridiculously non-ergonomic throne. He listened. He didn't offer solutions. He just held her hand, his cool, still fingers wrapped around her warm, living ones. I'm sorry, he said. And he meant it. The next day, Britt came to him with a look of quiet determination on her face. This is a lot, she said, gesturing vaguely to the castle, to him, to the whole impossible situation. My coffee shop being demolished by some shadow company because a rival vampire queen is mad at you? It's not a normal relationship problem. Lucian's non-beating heart sank. This was it. She was leaving. It was the logical conclusion. I know, he said, his voice quiet. My world is small and breakable, she continued, looking him straight in the eye. And your world is this. It's ancient and dangerous and full of people who hold grudges for literal centuries. I can't protect myself from that. And you'll always be trying to protect me, and it'll make you do things, like the ketchup thing and the locket thing. He noticed she'd added the locket. Fair. So, she said, taking a breath, I have to ask. Are you sure you want this? Because I'm in. I'm all in. But it's going to be messy, and you hate messes. He stared at her. She wasn't leaving. She was asking for his commitment. She was offering him a choice, the same way she did every day. For longer than anyone should have to carry alone, he had never needed anyone. He had been a fortress, self-contained and untouchable. But Britt had walked right through the gate he never knew he'd left open. She hadn't been intimidated by the walls. She just pointed out they could use a new coat of paint. He realized, with the force of a divine revelation, that his loneliness hadn't been a product of his power. It had been a product of his solitude. He didn't just want her. He needed her. He needed her messy, mortal, wonderfully complicated world to feel like his own endless existence had a point. "Britt," he said, and his voice was thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He stepped forward and took her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life." She looked up at him. He had maybe 3 inches on her, this supposedly terrifying vampire king, and her eyes were bright. "Good," she said, "because I already started the research." The research was magnificent. Britt had set up a command center at her kitchen table. Laptop open, 3 browser tabs, a legal pad covered in her chaotic handwriting. Admiral Nelson asleep on the stack of printed city ordinances she'd pulled from the public records database at 2 a.m. "The corporation that bought the building is called Cascadia Renewal LLC, she said, not looking up from her screen. "Which is registered in Delaware, obviously, because that's where shady shell companies go to be born. But their articles of incorporation list an agent whose address is a P.O. box in Bellevue, and the P.O. box is also listed on 3 other LLCs, all of which have made similar buyout offers on small businesses in neighborhoods with, and I love this, high walkability redevelopment potential." Lucian, who had arrived at her apartment expecting to offer emotional support and instead found himself attending a lecture on corporate forensic accounting, sat in the kitchen chair she had designated as his. His white hair was tied back with one of her scrunchies, a purple velvet one she'd put on him weeks ago as a joke that had simply become reality. He was holding a mug of coffee he could not drink. He was riveted. "You found all of this in one night?" he asked. "Public records are public, Victorian. You just have to know where to look." She finally glanced up. "Also, I found a creek." A creek. Behind the building. It feeds into a wetland that connects to the Duwamish River watershed, which means it falls under the city's enhanced environmental buffer zone. She turned the laptop to face him. On the screen was a highlighted section of municipal code, dense with legal language. Section 23.60A.190. You can't demolish a structure within 60 feet of a Class 2 waterway without a full environmental impact review, which takes 18 months minimum, and the developer's permits don't account for it. Lucian read the code. He had centuries of experience reading legal documents. This one was ironclad. "They missed it," he said. "They missed it." Britt's smile was the smile of a woman who had just found a data point that changed everything. A multi-million-dollar real estate deal, and they didn't check for a creek. She contacted the city planning office the next morning. She organized a meeting with 3 neighboring business owners. She drafted a petition with the kind of meticulous, obsessive detail that made her excellent at tracking true crime cold cases and absolutely lethal in municipal advocacy. She showed up at the public comment session of a city council meeting in the same hoodie she wore to work, holding a folder of printed evidence and a speech she'd rehearsed in front of Admiral Nelson, who had given it an indifferent but not hostile reception. "The proposed demolition of 4717 Ballard Avenue violates Section 23.60A.190 of the Seattle Municipal Code," she told the council, her voice steady, her hands only slightly trembling. "The developer's environmental assessment fails to account for the Class 2 waterway running within 42 feet of the rear property line. I have the survey data, the watershed classification, and a letter from the Army Corps of Engineers confirming the waterway status." I also have a petition signed by 217 local residents who would prefer to keep their coffee shop. She sat down. The council member in charge of environmental review pulled up the survey on his tablet and frowned. The faceless corporation, faced with a PR nightmare, unexpected legal hurdles, and a barista who had apparently weaponized her attention to detail, quietly withdrew its offer. The daily grind was safe. Lucienne had watched the entire council meeting from the back of the room, wearing a baseball cap Alistair had provided and looking profoundly uncomfortable in it. He had said nothing. He had compelled no one. He had simply watched the woman he loved dismantle a shadow corporation's real estate play with a creak, a municipal code, and the same relentless focus she brought to identifying a podcast killer's motive. He had never been more proud. Alistair, who had also been in attendance, disguised as a mild-mannered accountant in a beige cardigan, leaned over to whisper, "My liege, the betting pool." "What about it?" "The new long-shot wager. She defeats a vampire queen using municipal zoning law. Has just paid out at 5,000 to 1. He paused. "I did not place that bet. I am deeply regretting that decision." It was Britt who brought it up, because of course it was. They were on the fire escape of her apartment, a week after the council meeting. It was late enough that the city had gone quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the freeway and the soft ticking of Admiral Nelson's claws on the windowsill behind them. Lucian sat with his back against the brick wall, his white hair loose around his shoulders, catching the light from a street lamp below. Britt was beside him, her knees drawn up, a mug of tea balanced on one knee. "So," she said, in the same tone she used when she was about to present a theory on her podcast. "I've been thinking about the math." "The math," he repeated. "The mortality math. You don't age. I do. At some point, not now, not soon, but at some point, that becomes a problem. A big, unavoidable, data-set-ending problem." Lucian went very still. He had thought about this, of course. He had thought about almost nothing else in the quiet hours when she slept, and he sat watching the terrible fragility of her breathing. But he had not expected her to be the one to name it. He should have known better. "You're talking about turning," he said. "I'm talking about the options," she corrected. "Turning is one option. The other option is you watch me get old and die, which, respectfully, seems like it would destroy you, and I'd rather not be responsible for breaking a vampire king." "You would not be responsible, Lucian." She looked at him. "I would absolutely be responsible. I'd be the one who died." He didn't have an answer for that. She was, as usual, correct. "So tell me about it," she said. "Turning. What does it actually involve? Not the movie version, the real version." He was quiet for a long time. The street lamp below them flickered. "It is not gentle," he said finally. "It is a death. Your heart stops. Your body changes at a fundamental level. There is pain, significant pain, and a period afterward where everything you were is still there, but everything you are is different. Your senses, your needs, your relationship to time." He paused. "Some people describe it as waking up in the same room, but finding that every piece of furniture has been moved 3 inches to the left. You recognize everything. Nothing is where you expect it to be." Britt considered this. "Can I still drink coffee?" "No." "Can I smell coffee?" "Yes, exquisitely." "Can I still listen to podcasts?" "You can listen to them with hearing so acute, you will be able to identify which host is drinking from a mug versus a thermos." "That's extremely specific, and I'm into it." She was quiet for a moment. Would I still be me? It was the question he'd been dreading. Not because the answer was complicated, but because it was honest. "Yes," he said, "and no. You would be you. Your mind, your memories, your personality, your deeply alarming knowledge of municipal zoning law. But the experience of being you would change. Food would become irrelevant. Sleep would disappear. The sun would become dangerous. And time, he stopped. Time becomes very different when there is no end to it. Different how? You stop being surprised by things, he said quietly. The world becomes predictable, repetitive. You've seen every variation of human behavior, every political cycle, every war started for the same 3 reasons. After long enough, the world feels like a song you've heard too many times. He looked at her. You are the first new thing I have encountered in longer than I can express. I would not want to be the reason that quality disappears from you. Britt was silent for a long time. A plane crossed overhead, its lights blinking red and white. Okay, she said. Here's what I think. He braced himself. I think it's too early to decide. I think we're having this conversation because I'm a planner and you're a worrier, and together we've created the world's most anxious couple. She smiled just slightly. But I also think that when the time comes, and it will come, I want it to be my choice. Not yours, not Alistair's, not the council's. Mine. It would always be your choice, he said, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything. Good. She leaned her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her, careful, cold, steady. Because I have a lot of podcast episodes to catch up on, and I'm going to need enhanced hearing to figure out if Kate is drinking wine during the recording sessions. I've had my suspicions since episode 47. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. Her hair smelled like coffee and the cheap shampoo she bought in bulk. It was the best thing he had ever smelled. Take your time, he said. I always do, Victorian. Morning, coffee maker brewing, podcast faintly playing. The final scene of their beginning unfolded not in the Gothic castle, but in her small, cluttered apartment. It was a Tuesday. She was making them coffee, hers to drink, his to smell. The Murders and Mochas podcast was playing softly. Kate and Becca were breathlessly discussing the lost colony of Roanoke. Lucian, looking magnificently out of place in a tailored shirt and trousers, was perched on a stool in her tiny kitchen. It wasn't Croatoan, he said, unable to resist. They were assimilated into a local tribe 2 hours' walk to the south. Their leader, John White, was an idiot. He misread the map. Britt rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. She handed him his mug. He held it in both hands, letting the warmth seep into his cold fingers. Okay, Victorian, she said affectionately. He looked at her, at the way the morning light from the window caught the stray hairs around her face. He had no power here, no leverage. He was just a man, a vampiric man who looked barely old enough to rent a car, but carried the weight of more history than any textbook. Yet a man nonetheless, who was loved by a woman he could not control. She could walk away tomorrow and his entire world would crumble. And it was the most secure he had ever felt. You know, she said, leaning against the counter, you're getting better at the eye contact. It's almost normal now. Lucian didn't answer. He just looked at her, his gaze steady and full of a quiet, profound adoration. He didn't need to compel her. He didn't need to command her. He just needed to be here, chosen, in the warm, chaotic, beautiful mess of her life. And for the first time, eternity didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a gift.